In the Wild West, survival depended as much on the tools a person carried as on their grit. From firearms to wagons to mining picks, the frontier was shaped by gear built for endurance, violence, and movement. Every object told a story of hard labor, daily danger, or sudden death. The most iconic firearm of the era was the Colt single-action army revolver, introduced in 1873. Known as the Peacemaker, it became the standard sidearm for soldiers, lawmen, and outlaws alike. It fired 6 rounds and was famed for reliability and ease of use. Winchester rifles were equally famous for their role in frontier life. The 1873 model, dubbed the gun that won the West, was a lever-action rifle with high capacity and fast cycling. Hunters, settlers, and cowboys favored it for defense and hunting. Shotguns were also common in the West, particularly the double-barreled variety. Stagecoach guards and bank security often carried them for close-range power. The term riding shotgun originated from armed guards protecting stagecoaches with these weapons. Military rifles like the Springfield Model 1861 and the Henry repeating rifle were used by soldiers and sometimes sold or traded to civilians. Native warriors occasionally acquired them through trade or battlefield salvage. Firearms quickly changed the nature of tribal warfare. A Bowie knife was a standard tool and weapon for many men on the frontier. Named after Jim Bowie, it was large, sharp, and versatile, used for skinning animals, chopping firewood, or in hand-to-hand combat. Many carried one as a backup to their firearm. Cowboys carried revolvers and knives, but also relied heavily on their saddles and ropes. A good saddle could last decades, and a strong lariat was essential for roping cattle or hauling gear. Horse tack was often personalized and repaired by hand. Horses were a cowboy's most valuable asset. Breeds like the American quarter horse were fast, strong, and well suited to the open range. Stealing a horse was a hanging offense in many towns due to the hardship it caused the victim. Saddlebags, canteens, and bedrolls completed the standard cowboy setup. Everything had to be lightweight and durable for long days and rough terrain. Many cowboys owned only what they could carry on their horse. Stagecoaches were the lifelines of transportation before the railroads. Pulled by teams of 4 to 6 horses, they carried mail, passengers, and valuables across hostile landscapes. Wells Fargo and Butterfield Overland were 2 major companies running stage lines. Inside a stagecoach, space was tight and the ride was rough. Passengers often had to sit 3 across with luggage on their laps. Dust, heat, and bandits made every journey a gamble. Stagecoaches were often reinforced with steel or iron panels to protect against gunfire. Guards, known as shotgun messengers, sat beside the driver with rifles or shotguns. The threat of robbery was always present. Wagons were used for everything from cross-country migration to frontier commerce. Covered wagons, or prairie schooners, carried pioneers west along trails like the Oregon and Santa Fe. They were often overloaded and prone to breakdowns. The typical wagon carried hundreds of pounds of food, tools, and household goods. Iron cookware, dried beans, flour, bacon, and coffee were common provisions. Spare wagon wheels, axles, and grease were essential for repairs. Oxen were more commonly used than horses to pull wagons during migration. They were slower but stronger and required less water. Their endurance made them ideal for crossing vast plains and deserts. Black powder was the standard propellant for firearms and mining explosives. Carried in horns or paper cartridges, it was volatile and dangerous if stored improperly. A single spark could ignite a deadly explosion. Miners relied on pickaxes, shovels, sluice boxes, and pans to extract gold from riverbeds. Placer mining was the simplest method, using water to separate gold from gravel. Hard rock mining required tunnels, dynamite, and more manpower. Gold scales, assay kits, and strongboxes were essential tools for evaluating and transporting gold. Assayers determined purity and weight, which affected a miner's payout. Banks and stage lines provided secure transport. Saloon culture was inseparable from the Wild West. Bartenders used tin cups, glass tumblers, and barrels of whiskey, often of questionable quality. Poker chips, dice, and roulette wheels were common features. Faro was the most popular gambling game of the era, even more than poker. It involved a layout, a dealing box called a case keeper, and fast-paced betting. Cheating was rampant, and many games ended in gunfire. Cards were printed on thick stock with bold, simple designs. Marked decks and loaded dice were common cheating tools. Gamblers often carried small derringer pistols for protection. The telegraph revolutionized communication across the frontier. Lines were strung along railroad tracks and sent messages using Morse code. Telegraph keys, batteries, and wires were the main tools of this system. Railroads used iron rails, wooden ties, and massive steam locomotives powered by coal or wood. Each train had a boiler, firebox, and whistle to communicate with workers. Trains moved goods, cattle, and people faster than any wagon ever could. Railroad workers used sledgehammers, spike mauls, and tongs to lay tracks across dangerous terrain. Chinese immigrants in the West laid much of the Central Pacific Line, often blasting through mountains with dynamite. The cow catcher, mounted on the front of a locomotive, cleared debris from the tracks. Brakemen rode on the tops of rail cars, manually turning wheels to slow trains before air brakes were invented. Working conditions were brutal and often fatal. Cattle drives moved herds of longhorns across hundreds of miles. Cowboys used branding irons to mark ownership, and chuck wagons carried supplies and food. Drives could take weeks and crossed rivers, deserts, and native territory. Branding involved heating irons in a fire and pressing them into the animal's hide. Each ranch had a unique symbol, and rustling another man's cattle was grounds for execution. Brand registries were kept by county clerks. The chuck wagon was a rolling kitchen operated by a cook called the cookie. It carried flour, beans, coffee, bacon, and cast-iron pots. Meals were cooked over an open fire and served on tin plates. Lanterns and candles were primary sources of light in homes and towns. Whale oil, kerosene, and animal fat were used for fuel. Fires were a constant danger in tightly built wooden towns. Cast-iron stoves became common in homes and cabins. They were used for cooking and heating, requiring regular cleaning and chimney maintenance. Wood had to be chopped daily to fuel them. Axes, saws, and draw knives were critical for frontier woodwork. Buildings, furniture, and fence posts were made by hand using simple tools. Homesteaders often built entire cabins alone, or with help from neighbors. Wells were dug by hand using buckets and pulleys, or drilled with crude rigs. Windmills later helped pump water from underground. Clean water was essential for survival, and many disputes occurred over access. The frontier doctor's tools included bone saws, forceps, and leather straps to restrain patients. Anesthesia was rare, and whiskey doubled as a painkiller. Amputations and tooth extractions were often done with no more than grit and prayer. Saddle makers, blacksmiths, and general store owners were essential to town life. Blacksmiths used bellows, anvils, and hammers to shape iron for horseshoes and tools. Their forges served as repair shops for the entire town. Barber tools included straight razors, leather strops, and handheld clippers. Many barbers also served as surgeons, pulling teeth or stitching wounds. A trip to the barber could mean a shave or a medical procedure, depending on the town's resources. General stores sold everything from ammunition and coffee to fabric, nails, and lantern wicks. Items were stored in wooden crates and burlap sacks, often labeled in stencils. Bartering was common, especially in areas far from established currency circulation. Printing presses operated in many frontier towns, used to publish newspapers, posters, and legal notices. Type was set by hand, using metal blocks arranged backward. Newspapers were essential for sharing news, wanted posters, and town laws. Dry goods merchants stored flour, sugar, beans, and salt in wooden barrels and cloth sacks. They weighed items on hanging balance scales with metal weights. Many stores doubled as post offices and gathering places. Sheriffs and marshals carried revolvers, handcuffs, and paper warrants. Wanted posters were printed with woodcut illustrations or crude photographs. Jails consisted of iron bars, padlocks, and sometimes only a single locked room. Bank vaults were built from thick steel and used rotating combination locks. Telltale signs of a past robbery included drilled holes, scorched wood from explosives, and scattered coins. Outlaws often targeted banks due to their poor defenses and isolated locations. Towns used bells and flags to signal danger, fire, or celebration. A single bell tower could warn of attacks or call townspeople to meetings. Fire brigades used hand pumps and bucket brigades to fight blazes. Schoolhouses were one-room buildings with slate boards, chalk and wooden desks. Teachers used switches for discipline and McGuffey readers to teach children how to read. Many schools had no heat or insulation. Mail delivery was done on horseback or by stagecoach. Saddlebags held letters and packages, while postal workers carried pistols in dangerous areas. Delays were common due to weather, robbery or terrain. Pony Express riders carried lightweight satchels known as mochilas that draped over the horse's saddle. Each stop changed the horse but not the rider until their run was done. The service lasted only 18 months before the telegraph made it obsolete. Frontier photographers used large box cameras with glass plate negatives and explosive flash powder. Portraits were often stiff and serious due to long exposure times. Traveling photographers sometimes set up tents in mining towns. Medicine was sold in glass bottles with cork stoppers and handwritten labels. Common ingredients included alcohol, opium, mercury, and herbs. Patent medicine companies used bold claims and colorful labels to sell remedies for everything from coughs to heartbreak. Doctors carried wooden boxes or leather satchels filled with scalpels, syringes, and tonics. Snake oil salesmen traveled from town to town with flashy pitches and false cures. The lack of regulation made fraud easy and widespread. Miners used headlamps powered by oil or candles mounted on hats. They carried hand drills, dynamite sticks, and blasting caps into tunnels. Accidents from cave-ins, gas pockets, and explosions were frequent. Saloons featured wooden bars, swinging batwing doors, and brass footrails. Bartenders used corkscrews, jiggers, and glass mugs for pouring drinks like whiskey, beer, and sarsaparilla. Piano players and gambling tables added to the atmosphere. Women in saloons often worked as entertainers, dancers, or prostitutes. They wore corsets, feathered hats, and jewelry, and often carried small weapons for protection. Their lives were difficult and frequently dangerous. Train robbers used masks, dynamite, and signal flags to stop locomotives. They sometimes rode alongside trains and leapt onto them in motion. Inside, they targeted safes, mailbags, and first-class passengers. Safe crackers used stethoscopes, chisels, and black powder to open strongboxes. A skilled thief could open a lock silently, while others relied on brute force and time. Lawmen sometimes found blown safes empty miles from the robbery site. Wells Fargo agents traveled armed and used armored strongboxes with double locks and chains. The company became synonymous with security, delivery, and communication across the frontier. Its armed coaches were designed to resist ambush. Outlaws concealed weapons in coat linings, boots, or saddlebags. Some carried tiny derringers in hats or corsets for backup. Concealed carry laws varied from town to town, but were difficult to enforce. Bounty hunters traveled light, carrying weapons, manacles, and copies of wanted posters. They used telegraph lines and stagecoach routes to track targets. The most successful were known for speed, toughness, and knowing when to shoot. Dance halls had raised floors, oil lamps, and live musicians. Dances were held nightly in towns with large male populations. Women were in short supply, and tickets were sold for each dance. Churches were built with simple tools: hammers, nails, saws, and sweat. Pulpits were handmade, pews were carved, and bells were hauled up manually. Religion was a powerful force in many frontier communities. Printing press operators mixed ink by hand, arranged letters backward, and turned heavy wheels to produce each page. A single newspaper could take hours to print. Most frontier towns had at least one local paper. Militia units carried Springfield rifles, wore mismatched uniforms, and drilled in open fields. They were activated during Indian conflicts, labor disputes, and disasters. Their gear included tents, tin cups, and cartridge belts. Firewood was chopped using axes and stored in piles near cabins. Winters required months of preparation. Misjudging the wood supply could mean freezing to death before spring. Hunting provided food and pelts for trade. Trappers used steel leg-hold traps, knives, and rifles to catch beavers, wolves, and foxes. Furs were bundled and carried to trading posts for barter. Trading posts exchanged tools, blankets, flour, and ammunition for furs, gold, or horses. Scales, ledgers, and measuring cups were used to track transactions. Some operated with native tribes in long-standing partnerships. Bridges were made of wood and iron and were prone to collapse under heavy wagons. River crossings used ferries pulled by rope or hand-powered winches. Drownings were common when storms or ice took out the supports. Mail-order catalogs revolutionized access to goods. Farmers and settlers could order rifles, stoves, seeds, or clothes through thick catalogs like those from Sears, Roebuck, and Co. Orders were delivered by rail or post. Locks and keys were handmade by blacksmiths or ordered from eastern factories. Frontier towns had little protection from skilled burglars. Safe storage was often limited to a single strongbox or buried chest. Whips and bridles were crafted by hand using leather, rivets, and wooden handles. Teamsters controlled wagons with shouts and sharp commands. Poorly maintained gear often led to accidents. Outlaws used signal mirrors, coded messages, and tree blazes to communicate in the wilderness. Trails were marked with stones or carvings. Some gangs developed their own signs to mark loot caches or safe houses. Bartering was still common, where cash was scarce. Chickens, eggs, and hides were traded for tools or services. General stores kept ledgers to record ongoing credit or exchange balances. The gear of the Wild West was a blend of homemade, imported, and improvised. Every object served a purpose, whether for defense, travel, survival, or business. It was not the romantic image shown in film. It was functional, gritty, and essential. This concludes Episode 5 of The Wild West with Simon. In Episode 6, we will explore Women of the West, Grit, Guns, and Glory, the true roles of women who farmed, fought, healed, and survived in one of the harshest times in history. Let me know when you are ready to saddle up.